Welcome to New West Press Audio, the official podcast of New West Press. We're an independent publishing outfit located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. My name is Matt Bowes. I'm the general manager here at New West, and with me today is Myrna Kostash, author of the new book, Ghosts in a Photograph, a Chronicle. How are you today, Myrna?
Oh, I'm super duper. I'm looking forward to doing this. I love talking about this book. It's my new baby.
Perfect. Yeah, well, you got to talk about it so people buy it. It's great. You can't be Thomas Pynchon anymore, I think. I think authors need to be out there kind of, mixing it up and getting into people's faces. Otherwise, they're kind of stuck, right?
Well, especially on these so-called platforms, these digital platforms, because we've disappeared from print for the most part. I mean, you take a look at the so-called book review sections of our legacy newspapers.
I was so mad on Friday that all that Globe and Mail did was, an interview with Ian McEwan of all people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like he needs the press.
Exactly. He needs the Canadian press for some reason.
Drives me nuts. Anyway, yes. So thank you for this opportunity to have a podcast.
No problem. We have to make our own media if the legacy media won't listen to us. So this one, we control everything about it, though. So that's good. But Ghost in a Photograph. Do you want to tell our listeners what this book is about? Because it ties into a lot of your earlier work, but I think this is probably, as far as I've read, like one of the ones that really delves into some, difficult territory.
Yeah, it does many different things. And actually, I guess you could call it creative nonfiction. And by that, I mean a genre which is part this, part that, part this. And so this is part memoir, part travelogue, part research, part reflection. It's all of those things mixed up into one. But you might think that a book called Ghosts in a Photograph would be about family photographs. And you wouldn't be wrong, of course. And so this book actually started with the photograph, discovery of a photograph in a book published here in Canada, actually, of a relative I never knew I had in Soviet Ukraine, who had a very dramatic life story, as I came to learn parts of it. But it was absolutely unknown to us in Canada. And so it was that really that sparked the rest of this book and the rest of the photographs. Well, if we didn't know about this guy, who else didn't we know about?
Of course, yeah.
Who were the Kostashes in this case, or Kostashchuks, as they still are in Ukraine? Who were they, other than the ones that, of course, that we knew in Canada? And so this also raises then for me the question that, or sort of associated with this exploration and the photographs, is that all my grandparents came here as grown-ups. They came between 1900 and 1912. In other words, they had grown up in a village in Galicia, and now what is Western Ukraine. Well, what have those lives been? And the lives of some of the relatives that they left behind, the ones that never emigrated. Okay. The only story we grew up with, I'm sure I speak for many, many descendants of settler populations, the only story we grew up with here in Canada was day one on the homestead. The day the Baba and Jido got title to the legendary 160 acres, settled down, had these really hard lives, but in the end it all worked out. And as they aged and passed on, became known as our pioneers.
Yeah, you can see them on a Red River cart, and the guy is chewing on a stalk of wheat, and it's very cinematic, but that is interesting that you say that your family all emigrated as adults and they had entire lives back in Ukraine. And and dealing with Tsarist Russia would not have been a picnic. So you can see why they wanted to leave.
I want to correct some misconceptions as well in this storytelling. They did not come from Tsarist Russia. It was very, very difficult to emigrate from Tsarist Russia. The Ukraine they came from belonged to the Austro-Hungarian.
Okay, right. Yeah.
And that's Galicia, and which itself then becomes part of Poland and then becomes part of the Soviet Ukraine eventually after Second World War. So that's why we have this really helpful map. I hope.
Yeah. Well, it was a challenging map to put together too, because those borders really shifted around over 1900 to, let's say, the 40s, and then after that, the 89. Like everything moved around so much that it's actually hard to take a snapshot, a photograph, if you will, of what that place actually looked like.
Exactly. Do that on one page, right?
Yeah.
And I'm very pleased with it. I think it's pretty well. We'll hear from readers whether explain. But I also set out a timeline. Here are the important dates covered as we go from 1900 even earlier to the present day, and not just in terms of Ukrainian or European history, but interweaving that with important moments in Canadian history and bringing us up to both, let's say, the Multiculturalism Act, and then much more recently, the report on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So this gets me then to the elephant in the room in terms of any of these stories about settling on the land. And that is the part of the mythology, and you need to only go to a heritage festival. The mythology is that we came to free land, seemed to have dropped out of the sky, and now we're taking measure of, and I certainly do, so try to come to terms with this in the book. No, it wasn't free, actually. This came to us through Treaty 6, which is never mentioned. So Treaty 6 negotiated in 1876 on the land that a large number of us Ukrainian Canadians settled, right? And plains had been cleared of the buffalo, and native indigenous people were put on reserves. We never saw them, out of sight, out of mind. That no longer is tenable or sustainable as a story of who we are. Okay.
Well, that ties into your last two works with New West, Seven Oaks and Frog Lake Readers, where you're telling sort of interactions between settlers and Indigenous people in the 19th century leading up to when the Kostashes could have arrived here from Galicia, right?
Bingo. And actually, I do revisit that moment in the sort of conclusion of the book, which I call On the Land, where I just stand up for myself as a writer, saying, okay, what's all this got to do with me? And the bingo moment is exactly that one that's in the Frog Lake Reader, when I come across the mass grave of warriors, Cree warriors, who were hanged in a mass hanging in 1885 at Fort Battleford, and literally dumped in a mass grave, which you can now visit and is properly sort of dignified. But what's striking about that is that on the gravestone, that now marks all their names in Cree and in English, the dates 1885, right? And I'm thinking, wait a second, 1885, that's only 15 years before the Kostashes came. Like a mere 15 years later, we start our story without any reference to there being a prehistory. It's not unlike, I'm just thinking of it now, Matt, actually, it's not unlike the fact that we never made reference to the history that preceded arrival, the history back in Galicia, which turned out to be a minefield when I started looking at who these Kostashes were, who these Maximics were. So on one side, on Kostash side, it turns out there's a couple of writers. Hello, I'm not even the first writer. And on the other side, on my maternal grandparents' side, or grandmother's side, actually, are two brothers who had very murky ends, and they were both very much on the left. In fact, one of them actually a Bolshevik. So this is what is kind of exhumed along with the prehistory, Indigenous history that precedes us. And that's how I try to weave these two things together. Now, it should be said that all of Baba's Children, which was my first book 45 years ago, which is still in print thanks to US Press. I never said anything about the Indigenous presence either at that time. It was all about just being Ukrainian Canadian, being ethnic and all this kind of stuff, right? Now I go back, in a sense, you said, yes, this book sort of brings me back in a kind of circle to where I began in 1975 with all of Baba's Children, and then things in between, of course. But now I'm looking through the lens of a much more accomplished writer. I'm a much more mature person. I've traveled, I've thought, I've argued, I've had the scales fall from my eyes, all of that stuff. And so I bring that to bear on these stories of the grandparents and the relatives. So I'm looking at them through a feminist lens, through gender, through class, through stereotypes, through mythologies. And I'm openly engaging with those stories, right? So there is a kind of memoiristic tone to it, but it's not a memoir. I insisted on this right from the beginning, as you know, with the
chronicle. Yeah, we had that conversation like day 2.
Exactly. So I'm very pleased that it's called a chronicle, because I think that is much more indicative of the scope, the comprehensiveness of what I'm trying to do, but still has that more intimate first person narrator inside this material as well. Well, the readers will tell us whether that works for them or not.
Well, you've got your finger on the pulse too, just because there is, like you mentioned with those brothers, there is a bit of a true crime element to this too, because they were engaged in some fairly difficult practices during the war, and not entirely sure what happened to those guys. And I thought that was a really interesting little section of the book, just because, growing up in Alberta as I did, I knew basically nothing about Ukraine's role in World War II and the shifting alliances. And yeah, it's incredibly murky. But the more research I've done in Ukrainian history, it's that it's always been in the middle of everything all the time, and you can't really pin down what's going to happen next.
Absolutely. That's really well put, Matt. And of course, we're right in the middle of such a situation right now. Who can tell
Hmm.
what's going to happen next? Poor Ukraine. And I've been watching this is probably off topic, but Timothy Snyder, who's one of the great
Hmm.
resources for the history of what he calls the bloodlands. Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus, which is where most deaths, Jewish and non-Jewish, occurred during the Second World War.
Hmm.
He's now giving online, or it's also online through YouTube, a lecture course on the history of Ukraine at Yale, to undergraduates, and having to go through that history again, starting with Kiev and Rus, all the wars, in fact, and everything. You really wonder whether modern Ukraine is going to be able to skip that
Hmm.
inheritance, that DNA, if you like. But let's hope so. I do have relatives. They are second cousins. I visited them last in 2013. They live in Western Ukraine, out of harm's way, but of course they're going through all of the anxiety
Hmm.
and so on that Ukrainians are everywhere. The only help that we can really give them, my sister and I, is we send them gobs of money
Hmm.
so that they can heat their home over the winter, and this kind of thing, right? So, but it's there, on that, they're on my maternal grandmother's side, and that my grandmother's maiden name was Kosovan, and
Hmm.
this is the Kosovan family in Ukraine.
Hmm. Yeah, I've actually just finished listening to a really long podcast series that is ostensibly about the Russian Revolution in 1917, but looks at all the other things that spun out of that. And the thing that I found really interesting about Ukraine was the prevalence of anarchists, like the Black Flag, and what's his name was McNo, I think.
Oh my
This
God.
very heroic Ukrainian commander who just did not want to submit to anybody, and eventually they had to put him down basically because he was uh, too patriotic and too difficult to deal with as the authorities. And there something in the Ukrainian sort of soul that just makes you never give up on anything ever? Because that's what it seems like from reading this book and other things. Just that memory of the soil and keeping everything yourself. It's just
Well,
you're
yeah.
surrounded by such bigger antagonists all the time that they just never will give in on anything.
Well, yeah, it certainly looks like that. In a sense, never didn't have their own state except very periodically for a few months or a few years here and there, and then they would be divided up again among the neighboring empires. But what's happening now, I think, is very interesting, and that is that this is, I think, for the first time, you could say, a consolidation of the population, not just ethnically,
Hmm.
but all the people who live on that territory are now considered and bound by the patriotism that you speak of. It's not exclusively, it's not an ethnic exclusivity at all anymore,
Hmm.
which is more the tone that the factions took during the Second World War, right?
Hmm.
Not to mention, of course, the Jewish pogroms and so on that occurred as well in these
Yeah,
populations.
and
Of
class
course,
too. That was a big thing
yes,
too.
yes, yes. Now it's interesting, Matt. You mentioned Mr. Macron because he's in the Doom Bridegroom,
Hmm.
another one of your publications. And
Hmm.
he was an anarchist in southern Ukraine during the Civil War, 1919, 1920. He was actually assassinated in France
Hmm.
after the anarchist rebellion had collapsed in what would eventually become Soviet Ukraine.
Yeah, he's just kind of a romantic, sort of like the classic rebel, right? He just
Yeah,
never gives up, and
yeah,
it's one of
yeah.
those people you find while reading history, like, yeah, love reading about this guy. And it sounds like some of your ancestors that you encountered while reading this book, you also sort of just really enjoyed learning about them, whereas other ones you were less interested to find out about some of the stuff that they got up to.
I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Well, I'm just saying that in one part you say that one of your ancestors is beautiful yet deadly, and it is that sort of allure of just like, yeah, like they lived in a different time, and I could sit here in my office and kind of appreciate my easy Canadian life, but they had much more difficult things to deal with all the time, and you can kind of daydream like, would I have been able to hack it in that sort of situation?
You're referring to Stepan Kostashchuk, who was the one photograph I found in the book, and he died by suicide in 1951
Hmm.
in a bunker in the Carpathians rather than be taken by the Soviets.
Yeah,
Yeah, but that was a kind of inglorious struggle because that was the one
yeah.
of the ultra right turned now out to be the ultra right party and so on.
Well,
Anyway,
yeah,
yeah,
that's that history. It's like how can like there's so many political factors at play, and one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. It could be
exactly.
really challenging to. There's no clear heroes and villains a lot of the time. Is what
No,
I'm
and,
getting
and
at.
as I say in my book, I'm actually in the privileged position of not having had to make that choice.
Yeah,
Because my
yeah.
grandparents left the scene,
Hmm.
right? I now have this luxury of being unimplicated, really,
Yes.
and until I start to ask myself these questions, what would I have done? And yes, and you're right, this young man who was considered demonized as a terrorist during the Soviet period was gorgeous.
Hmm.
And he had this young wife who died with him, and they're buried together now in the grave in the village, and it's all, yes, it's quite the story. But
Yeah.
on the other side were the left-wing collaborators, if you like, and one of them was assassinated, probably for quote collaborating with the new Soviet authorities in his village.
Yeah.
He just disappeared. He was grabbed from the house and disappeared, probably shot really quickly in the forest, and that was the end of him.
Yeah, we're so lucky over here that there are great injustices caused by Canada, and we're working through reconciliation and trying to figure that out on our own. But it's it's not the same thing as your family members could have been on alternate sides of a political battle, right? Like
Exactly,
at
killing each
least,
other.
yeah,
Actually,
like that's
yeah.
so
Ireland
alien
maybe
to us.
was
Ireland,
the
yeah, that would be a big one.
most
Yes.
recent one. Yeah.
Yeah, or like the Tamil Tigers or something where
Oh God.
there's
Yeah.
there's just been internecine conflict for so long that you just go back a few generations and it's there. But one thing I was wondering is, so you do talk to a few older people in this book, but I'm assuming that most of the people, in fact probably all of them, anyone who remembers this period is long dead and their children are probably long dead. But was there a bit of a reticence to talk about things like, oh, where did all this free land come from? Like when talking to the settlers, do you think they maybe deep down understood that this was, the Canadian government had given them this land at the expense of other people?
Oh, just a second. It's my sister. Just a minute.
Sure.
Hi, Janice. I'm actually I'm being recorded for a podcast right now. Why don't I call you when I'm finished? Another how long, Matt? Another 10 minutes. Is that okay? Okay, call you then. Bye.
Yeah, I'll just reframe that one.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you look at a lot of primary sources, a lot of people's diaries upon having moved to Canada, and business records, that sort of thing. And it's something that came to me while I was reading the book, is that it's difficult for when you're looking back at your livelihood as a settler who has moved to this place and you're proud of your achievements, proud of your house, proud of your farm, that kind of thing. I'm just wondering, did they ever stop and think like, this wasn't really free land? The other people must have lived here.
No.
No, they
No.
wouldn't. It wouldn't have occurred to them.
No.
Like
When
presumably the Canadian government would have probably put that under the rug too. Like, oh yeah, come down. It's going to be great. There's no problems here.
when I first pressed the question within my own community, this in this case at my church, and that's my generation. I mean, we're already second generations in Canada, but still have that carried on, that sort of mythology of the free land. When I said, maybe we should have a special occasion that we mark as a Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada, for example, because we were coming up to one of our anniversaries, and give thanks Give
Mhm.
thanks to our Indigenous neighbors for the gift of the land. We didn't steal it from them. We didn't throw them off the land. We didn't kill them to get it, but it was theirs to begin with.
Yeah.
Oh, they said, well, actually, we got it through Wilfrid Laurier, or we got
Mhm.
it through Queen Victoria. So in that sense, they did understand the kind of succession, if you like,
Yeah.
but never behind that. I think it's because, and it was true for me, like when I wrote All of Baba's Children, that Indigenous people were out of sight, out of mind for that first generation, except when you now get those stories of the cooperation between settlers and Indigenous neighbors. But my feeling is that those were Métis. They
Mhm.
were off the reserve. Otherwise, there would not have been that kind of contact. So now there's a much greater awareness of this, especially the generations younger than mine now. They're carrying the ball on this one. It's
Mhm.
going to be really exciting to see. Do you know the phenomenon of the kukum scarf?
I think I've heard about it, but why don't you tell our listeners?
The kukum scarf is what we Ukrainians called the babushka. Right? It's that very colorful floral, sometimes black, sometimes green or something with fringes on it. Sometimes it's as large as just as large as a kerchief. Sometimes it's a whole shawl, bright red flowers on it.
Mhm.
Okay. This has now been taken up by a number of Indigenous women as part of their, well, they call it the kukum scarf, meaning the Baba
Yeah.
scarf as
Yeah.
well,
The
right?
grandma scarf for us wasps in the audience.
What do you call it?
Like a grandma scarf, you could say.
Yeah. But it's a very distinctive
Yeah.
one, right? And so that's the very interesting. I thought, oh, well, if we wear it now as Ukrainians, are we appropriating what is now a kukum scarf? This
Yeah.
could get a little, but anyway.
Well, yeah, that's kind of like the nicer aspect of, integrating cultures, is that something can have more than one meaning, and people could just enjoy a scarf and its designs. I think I actually have read a children's book about that, the cuckoo scarf. So
Oh yeah, I think there is one. Yeah.
yeah,
Now listen,
that's kind of the nice version of cooperation between different people on the land.
yeah, especially since it comes into the current generation, because the stories have just always stopped after that first generation on the land. After that, we
Mhm.
don't tell stories anymore about Indigenous neighbors. Right?
Mhm.
Now there's a generation that does. Yeah, I want to read from a chapter about one of the grandparents, and that's my mother's biological father, who she did not know. He died when he was young. She was only 5 here in Canada. Baba then remarried, but to his brother, who was already in the house. And so that's the sort of Jido that I knew, and that was the man who raised my mother. But I always heard about this real father of hers, and I tried to put together a story as best I could about him. Okay.
Sure.
So excerpts. I know 5 things about Nikolai Maximyuk. He died in 1918 when his daughter, my mother, was 4 years old. That's 1. After laboring in coal mines somewhere in Poland or Germany, he emigrated to Canada in 1911. That's 2. He settled in Edmonton and sent for his betrothed, my grandmother Palachna Kosovan, from the village of Judiu in Galicia. That's 3. He worked at a packing plant. That's 4. By age 33, he was dead. That's 5. I asked my second cousin, Petro Kosovan, in Zabolotyu, Ukraine, what he remembers of family lore about this Nikolai. And he wrote me an email. Nikolai went to Germany, earned extra money to go to Canada, went there, built a house, and then brought your grandmother over in 1912. At first, they were poor. They worked very hard, unquote, and end of story. Well, I had hoped for more from Ukraine, some thread of the story of Nikolai that they had passed on about this fantastical journey away from the village that had also taken their kinswoman, Palachna Kosovan, with him. The point of view of those who stayed behind, something to add to his life story as we told it in Canada. But it turns out that from our very different vantage points, a century after the main events and on different continents, Petro and I remember exactly the same things. But there are places, nooks and crannies where I go looking for my grandfather or someone like him. He does leave a trace of his brief life in a couple of civic and church documents, a school report, and 3 photographs, in the transcript of an interview by a researcher with my mother, and in my father's unpublished memoir, in a video ballad, on websites, in a Soviet Ukrainian gazetteer, and finally in one of Edmonton's cemeteries. In a folder of archival odds and ends assembled by my father ages ago, I find Nikolai's 6th grade school report glued on a large sheet of heavy brown paper and drawn up entirely in Polish. These Ukrainian villages were in fact being administered by Poland. I take this over to a Polish neighbor here in Edmonton who rattles off the school subjects: arithmetic, geometry, natural history, religion, reading, drawing, all of them dobrze, good, as well as bardzo dobrze, very good, in the study of the Polish language and in singing. By the way, those are Polish words, not Ukrainian. As recorded by the teacher with a flourish of his pen. Well, what to make of this document? That probably there were no more reports, the village school having no more to offer. That for all Nikolai's scholarly successes, he would go no further. No adventure down the King's Highway and the gymnasia or high school in Kolomea. He would go down the mines. When I visit his home office in Hamilton, retired professor of political science Peter Potichny sweeps his hand along the spines of a row of large books bound in blue cloth that are shelved under a windowsill that supports pots of ferns and geraniums. A nice touch of homeliness, I'm thinking, as the professor gestures again toward the books. Where were your grandparents born? Judiu and Holichina, Galicia. He extracts a volume explaining that it is part of a Soviet Ukrainian gazetteer published in the 1970s and flips its pages until page 564, where I can read for myself the half column of potted history of the village of Judiu, population 1,989. It entered the historical record in 1394, after which nothing seems to have happened there to interest Soviet scholars until the 1860s when a coal mine opened. I wondered why Nikolai had left home for the mines of Silesia when he could have stayed in Judiu and eked out the bride price for Palachna at the coal seam in his backyard. Nikolai gave 4 years to the mines in Silesia until he got the itch to go to Canada, but he wasn't after the land, the free quarter section. Land, soil, earth, the true measure of a peasant's wealth. But if there wasn't enough of it, it was just muck. Nikolai never homesteaded. He may have been processed by the immigration officer in Quebec City as an intended farmhand. But once through and out the sheds on the pier, he had no more intention of wheedling sustenance out of dirt, thick and black and loamy as it was, than of sailing the sands of Araby. Nikolai spent his small hoard of dollars on the purchase of a city lot in the northeast end of town, built a modest house on it, and then struck out for the packing plant further east in Edmonton's packing town. The Swift Canadian Company had opened operations in North Edmonton in 1908. By 1913, the plant employed 400 people, slaughtering cattle, hogs, sheep, and poultry. There are 3 extant photographs of Nikolai Maximyuk, one of them taken on his wedding day. I see a short, stocky, and swarthy man with a mustache that frames his upper lip and ends in a little twist. His dark brows are drawn together above a fixed, almost glinty gaze. His nose and ears are finely shaped, and he is as unsmiling as his bride. He's short, but with a manly set to his shoulders. He had, after all, built the house on the stoop of which the couple stands before he had sent for her. There is a second photo of Nikolai and Palachna's wedding day. It was quite a party. In the 3 years that Nikolai had been in Edmonton, he had acquired a sizable community of friends and compatriots, to judge from the crowd of men, women, and children, either sprawled on the grass or squished together in front of the house, 12518 83rd Street. My grandfather is distinguishable in his suit, white shirt, and tie from the unjacketed men, while my grandmother is a standout in a long white dress with its veil falling back from a floral crown. There is not a single embroidered shirt or sheepskin vest or headscarf to be seen. My mother always stuck to her story. My father died of pneumonia, walking to and from the meat packing plant. Or was it the work itself that weakened him? A working day in which 350 cattle, 1,200 hogs, 500 sheep and lambs, and 500 calves were slaughtered, their carcasses hauled around by men and not by machines. If Nick worked in the room where blood was dried to a powder for use in animal feed, this job alone, month after month, may have killed him. When the blood was dry, workers scooped it into gunny sacks, and after about 10 minutes of this operation, you couldn't see the fellow holding the bag and he's standing only 2 feet away from you. The tank house air was thick with fine dust, blood dust, and for the next 2 days you spat and choked, coughing up blood. Is that what happened to Nick? Meanwhile, at 12518 83rd Street up in the attic, Andrew, who had worked at Silesian Coal Faces alongside Nick, his older brother by 2 years, then waited to be sent the steerage ticket to Canada, arrived in 1912 and was settled into the attic room. There is another photograph of Nick together with Andrew with no caption, cropped top and bottom and lifted untidily from the black paper of a photo album. Now, this must have been taken in Canada to judge from the Canadian style of shirts, jackets, and ties the men wear. They stand side by side against a backdrop of a tall hedge. They don't look much like siblings, Nick having a darker complexion and thick dark brows and mustache that give him a martial air compared to Andrew's youthful, hairless face and woebegone expression. I don't suppose Nick died in a hospital. Who would have had the money for that? Was a doctor even summoned? Perhaps neighbors were summoned or were aroused by the sounds of my grandmother's unintelligible panic, my mother's wails, Andrew's helpless groans as he realized he was about to be set adrift in this grieving household. When it came time to bury Nick, I hope it is true that, according to a history of Ukrainian labor in Canada, funeral costs were paid from the wages he had earned but never collected. Not a pauper's grave then. There were gravediggers. It was winter. Did they lay him deep?
There we go. So you have an event coming up this week, actually, October 6th at 7 p.m. at the Parkdale-Cromdale Community League. You're going to be reading with Lori Graham. And yeah, I'm going to be there too. I'll be on stage. So if you're in Edmonton, please come out to that. There'll be information about it in the notes for this episode. But thanks so much for coming on the show, Myrna.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, this is Matt Bose from New West Press signing off.